Welcome to our rescheduled event from the Newcastle Writers Festival, in which we'll be asking how First Nations Australians are responding to and would like others to respond to the 250th anniversary of the visit of Lieutenant James Cook to the east coast of Australia. I'm Dr. Stephen Gapps, President of the History Council of New South Wales, and I'll be facilitating this session today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded lands and waters of the Sydney region where the History Council of New South Wales is based, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I wish to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today in this meeting, and also wish to thank and acknowledge our speakers here today. We're very lucky to have with us John Maynard, Warramai man and Professor of Indigenous Education and Research, Indigenous History at the University of Newcastle, and Dr. Mariko Smith, Yuin woman and First Nations Assistant Curator, Engagement Exhibitions and Cultural Connection from the Australian Museum. So thank you both so much for joining me today. Professor Maynard has been described as the foremost Indigenous historian in Australia. He was awarded a PhD examining examining the rise of early Aboriginal political activism from the University of Newcastle in 2003. His books, Fight for Liberty and Freedom, The Aboriginal Soccer Tribe and Aboriginal Stars of the Turf, have received high acclaim. John's research is focused on the intersections of Aboriginal political and social history, and made significant contributions to the research fields of Aboriginal race relations, sports history, both nationally and internationally. As I mentioned, Dr. Mariko Smith is a Yuin woman from the south coast of New South Wales and First Nations Assistant Curator at the Australian Museum. I first had the pleasure of meeting Mariko at the Australian National Maritime Museum's Ngawi Indigenous Watercraft Conference back in, I think it was 2012. I think at the time, this conference on the traditions, diversity, and cultural resurgence around canoe making in particular was a groundbreaking initiative that inspired Mariko in her doctoral thesis. Mariko's work now focuses on Indigenous community-based cultural resurgence initiatives and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into curatorial and artistic practices. So just a few things on today's session. It will be recorded, so please keep your mics on mute, but please do ask questions in the chat room. We would like today to be very much a conversation rather than a lecture, and really very much welcome questions and comments from our audience today, which I'm pleased to announce there's 100 registrations and it was sold out. We'll also try to leave some time at the end for responses and other questions, but it's fine and very welcome if you have a question as we go, and we'll try to get to it as soon as we can. And firstly, a little bit of background on the event. You may be familiar with the History Council as the organiser of History Week every September, which is an extremely popular series of events, particularly reaching out right around the state. You may not be as familiar with the History Council doing quite a few other things, including hosting awards and prizes and various talks and seminars, as well as advocacy for the history sector. As I mentioned, this talk was conjured up for the Newcastle Writers Festival in April this year, at a very different time, before the pandemic changed everything. Now, as part of the History Council of New South Wales History Effect series, we'll attempt to talk about what we were going to discuss, but obviously the focus on history that has swept many ex-colonial countries in particular, with the Black Lives Matter protests and the toppling of statues, has changed the landscape of what was meant to be a commemoration of 250 years since the 1770 arrival of James Cook and Endeavour, and on what was shaping up to be a significant protest alongside this. I want to flag too that the History Council and the Centre for Public History at UTS co-host another series of talks called History Now, and in July there will be a session that will be very much focused on the statue wars, and I encourage everyone to look out for that. It sounds great, and there will be a couple of international guest speakers, I think. So as mentioned, the original brief for this talk was constructed in a space where the impending commemoration of Cook's arrival on these shores was about to happen, where it seemed every national institution across the country was preparing an exhibit about 1770, where the replica Endeavour was about to tour on, along the east coast and call into Kamay and Wallumbarbiri on the exact days that Cook did 250 years before, where it seemed we're all heading towards yet another round of, albeit somewhat different events than in 1970, but still a round of anniversary reenactments and monument making. What our talk was going to discuss initially was to be based upon why one museum in particular had chosen not to create an exhibition about Captain Cook, but about the frontier wars. And I suppose I'd thought that we would be discussing the possibility of turning away from commemorating 1770 to other histories that have certainly been, for want of a better word, under-commemorated, at least by non-First Nations Australians. So we might begin with Mariko, and I wonder if Mariko, you could outline for us why the Australian Museum decided not to do anything around Endeavour, Cook and 1770, but chose to work towards an exhibition on frontier wars in 2020.
Oh, thank you, Stephen, and good to see you here too, John. Firstly, I too would like to acknowledge that I'm on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present. So, yes, the Australian Museum has been developing a First Nations-led right of reply to the 250th anniversary of Cook's East Coast voyage, and Whale woman Laura McBride, who was the lead curator, was given the task of curating an exhibition in response, and this was back in 2018. And so Laura and I are the First Nations curatorial team. From the beginning, we wanted to consult with First Nations peoples to determine the objectives and themes of the exhibition. So what we ended up doing was like front-end evaluation. So a little bit unusually, we didn't just go in with pre-set ideas about what we both wanted to see in the exhibition. We thought that community should be driving it. So we issued a short survey over a number of months, which, in line with, budget and time constraints, that was mid to late 2018, we ended up having 805 First Nations respondents giving feedback to the museum. Out of this, there were 175 different nations, cultural, language, groups and clans identified by respondents. Each of the major states and territories were represented. And this data provided a very clear set of objectives and content topics for the exhibition and associated programming. And it's very clear from the data that many communities don't want to talk about Cook, but instead want to focus on the legacy of colonisation, which was triggered by the events of 1770. So I'm just going to bring up 5. So we were asking people specifically on what word or thoughts come to mind when you hear or see the name Captain James Cook. As you can see here, the breakdown of the responses, we've got more than 87%. These were classified as negative descriptions and responses to Cook. You've got very, very small number of positive, and you've got a small but significant number of neutral responses too. So just to break those down, so in terms of neutral keywords, we were looking at responses that just described who Cook was. So he was like an explorer, a navigator, a sailor, he's a captain or lieutenant, describing related objects. So he was the one who sailed the Endeavour, the ship, and descriptions about context like first contact and discovery. And then with the positives, so, a very small number of responses, but, acknowledging that, he's learned, moral, connected to first settlement, connected to Australia, founding of Australia. But it's the negative responses that were quite comprehensive and very interesting. So, the responses were around, words like invasion, invader, calling him a murderer, killer, describing things like slaughter, he's a liar, fraud, Interestingly, there were quite a few responses about how he broke the king's orders. That's what came to mind. So he disobeyed his secret orders. Thief, pillaging, greed, colonialism, oppression, dispossession, distorted false Australian history, myth making. So it just goes on. And I'd like to just remind everyone, if they want to have a look at the full report, it's on the Australian Museum's website called the 2020 Project Community Consultation. We also noticed that the consultation results indicated that some respondents conflate 1770s, so Cook's voyage, with the arrival of the first fleet 18 years later in 1788. So that was quite interesting. And then these are some of the responses that we received. So you can see clearly on your screen there, those words that keep on coming up again about, racist, murderer, thief, invader, genocide. Just as we analysed the data, what we found interesting was the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people view Cook very differently from how mainstream Australians seem to perceive him and represent him. And I was struck particularly by there's a passage in Maria Nugent's book about Cook was here, and just quoting her, Aboriginal people used a character called Captain Cook to tell histories of their relations with white people, to explain their plight under British colonisation, to mark time before and after the arrival of colonists and settlers, and to outline their vision of a future that restores their law and sovereignty, among other things. And we found that the data really did feed into that representation, like how he's perceived. And so moving to question 6. So 6 and 7 were asking people just plainly, what would you like to see in this exhibition? And then question 7 is, what don't people want to see? And so in terms of this question 6, you can see here that the clear objectives that people want this exhibition to achieve from First Nations is truth telling. So telling the truth of Cook, the true story of Cook and the foundation of this country, and that being told and privileging First Nations voices and perspectives. And then in terms of the topics, you can see that colonisation and its effects was a very large segment of the responses, so 59%. So that's covering things like, what happened then and how has that impacted and how it affects ongoing. Massacres, murders, dispossession, loss of culture, land, languages, assimilation, genocide, stolen generations, and also about the destruction of land and all those ecological issues. And that's followed by, a closer examination of Australia's origins and foundations. So that's focusing on aspects like wars, Indigenous resistance, so frontier conflict, and particularly the legal foundation. So how did that decision get made in England about colonising Australia? Like, what did they use to rely upon? What arguments did they use to justify this possession? And, the fact that Cook disobeyed his orders. And, another thing is to focus on how First Nations peoples are not savages. We are no less, inferior to, to the British, and also the fact that there were international visitors, long before Cook as well. Another aspect is about the false story. So that's about constructed histories, how a particular selective history has been represented through the education system and through media, and trying to balance those representations and learning more about our culture pre-Cook. As one of our respondents, there's a really great quote saying, "Cook is but a small footnote in our more expansive history of 60,000+ years." So that's something really important to remember. And then some of the quotes here again. So the truth, the words truth, the truth, true story, that's come up again and again. Also words like truth telling. So the data is in line with how truth telling has been identified as a key objective. So Reconciliation Australia's barometer on reconciliation, that identified that truth telling was a key objective that many Australians identified with. And also, the Federal Parliament's Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition also highlighted truth telling as being a key objective. So, you know, comments like, don't focus on Cook, let's talk about us, it's our land, tell the truth about what really happened to our people. And just to make it even more clearer, so when we asked people, what don't you definitely not want to see in this exhibition? No Cook, no praise and glorification. You know, that came up very clearly. So no discovery, we don't want to use words like that. No racist views, no statues, monuments, reenactments. You know, a lot of people said no Cook. Some people say not just Cook. So it'd be more of a focus on us. So yeah, it's quite interesting what came out of the data there. So no more whitewashing of our history. Don't celebrate him as a hero. He's not a hero. So that's something that, you know, as we develop this show now, it's very clear that, you know, this is what community are saying to us, and this is what we say, you know, we say to people. This is very clear from the community perspective, the response to this year. So since receiving this feedback, we've been crystallising all these lot of data into a narrative. And so we've recently titled the exhibition Unsettled. And this is to illustrate that Australia was not peacefully settled, and that the history, environment and relationships between Australia and First Nations peoples is still unsettled, and often the history is unsettling. And due to the South Coast bushfires earlier this year, and now with COVID, it's impacted on further, you know, ongoing community consultation. So we've experienced some delays. And so this would mean that there'll be some delays in our show opening. So not later this year as planned, but in 2021. So yeah, those details still to be determined. So we'll keep an eye out for updates on that. So yeah, so that's our community consultation in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks, Mariko. I just want to, I might throw to John if you had any thoughts on that process, that interesting process of, well, I suppose really revisiting the whole rationale for what you do in a 250-year anniversary commemoration year as a museum. If you had any thoughts or responses?
Yep, thanks, Stephen. And look, I too like to begin as a Warramai man by respectfully acknowledging our people's upwards of 65,000 years sovereignty and never been ceded connection to this continent, and also pay respects to elders both past and present. But look, I want to just commend Mariko and all the team down there and the museum. This is a really exciting step. I mean, I think this is it's a unique approach. It's an approach that gives a more balanced understanding of history. And let's look at things from different vantage points. And for me, the most exciting thing is they've privileged Indigenous voices. They've privileged Indigenous perspectives into this. That's not just discounting anybody else's point of view. And believe me, as I said, I come through a school system in the 1950s and 60s when we weren't in the history of this country. I mean, so it was all about explorers and discoverers and settlers and everybody else. But as far as we were concerned, we were, you know, stuck in the box of belonging to the Stone Age and the dying race. So we've come a long way when museums are starting to take note and listen to Aboriginal people in the way these things are shaped and managed. And as I said, again, I really commend the team for this step. I think, as I said, a very, very exciting move, and I think a great approach.
Thank you.
Mariko, did you want to add anything further on the Unsettled exhibition, or perhaps just maybe reflect a little on whether this whole process, what effect has it had on programming, permanent exhibitions in the museum in general?
Yeah, well, I think it just goes to show that, I mean, it was a really good opportunity to critically engage with ideas around how a colonial institution, particularly like the Australian Museum, which is Australia's first public, you know, museum, founded in 1827, and, you know, how the medium of a museum exhibition could be, you know, really effective platforms for change and challenging things like the national narrative. So it was really exciting in that sense, but it's a lot of, I guess it's a bit of soul searching for the museum as well. And I guess in line with the Museums Australia, you know, the roadmap, the Indigenous roadmap, there is an aspect about like, reflective statements. And then, this is really, in the broader context of things, this is an opportunity for museums to really have a look and reconcile themselves with their histories and what their roles have been in how Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples have been, perceived and represented. So they've had a really big stake, being complicit in things like scientific racism. So yeah, it's an exciting opportunity in that sense, being able to use this platform for more Indigenous voices, but also that sort of critical engagement too. And that was another question in our consultation, was what people thought of the Australian Museum. And, that data can speak to many other institutions, not just us, about how people, First Nations people, perceive museums. So we've got a lot of groundwork to do, but I think it's all at various ways of engagement. So museum exhibitions, but also programming where you have more, elders and cultural practitioners coming into the space and reclaiming the space, and also, I guess, the narrative and the stories.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's happening, I suppose, in other museums as well, which is great. In it, one of the things at the National Maritime Museum, for example, was that we often in the past have treated Aboriginal people as the subjects of exhibitions rather than the audience as well, and actually thinking about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want to see in an exhibition, and asking them what they want to see in an exhibition, rather than thinking it's the right thing to do an exhibition about their histories. I think that's a really significant shift. And I think that your survey has been absolutely groundbreaking in that. Maybe if we just slightly change tack a little bit, one of the things, the Australian Museum obviously has a long history that you've touched on, a complex history, connected to the tragic histories of Australian colonialism. It also happens to sit across the road from the Hyde Park Captain Cook monument that has been in the news. And I'm guessing, Mariko, that you actually, go to work every day and walk past that monument. Just wondered
yes, I do. Yeah, especially recently, because I've been mostly working from home, but in the last week or so, I've started going back into the office for some meetings, and considering the timing of, a very strong police presence in front of that particular statue. So I went up and had a bit of a, Captain Cook, a bit of a look at what's going on. And yes, when I looked up there, there's a police van that was right in front. So it's got a lot of surveillance cameras, but that visible police presence there, it's I just was just absolutely astonished at the photographs that were coming out of that night where you had the police guard around that statue. So yeah, it's really interesting, the placement. So I mean, every time I see that statue, it just reminds me how important the work that myself and Laura and the First Nations team and rest of the museum, our team on Unsettled have been doing. It just reaffirms, like what we need to do is about, tearing down history. So, not just statues, but tearing down sort of ideologies and these false histories.
Yeah, challenging this sort of stuff, that's for sure.
We've got a couple of questions coming through. I might. Yes, John.
I was just going to say, this goes back with the Captain Cook statue to Sid Grant back in 2017, when Stan Grant, I should say, Sid Grant. Stan Grant was walking through Hyde Park and come across that statue and read it that Cook discovered Australia, and Stan wrote that piece in the paper which challenged that. I mean, it misses the point that Aboriginal people have been here for upwards of 65,000 years, and Stan wanted, an addition put onto the statue, marking, that particular point, that Cook didn't discover Australia, Aboriginal, and the furor that erupted in the press at that time just goes to show the sentiments that are out there, and feel threatened by this, and and that is a myth, and it's been touched on before. The Portuguese had been here, the Spanish had been here, the Dutch had been here. So,
even other British, I think the trial, the trial was here before Cook.
Dampier. I mean, there's a whole host of things. So, you know, these things recognising that Cook did not discover Australia. So the whole issues over statues, of course, I mean, and I think, you know, maybe some of these statues need to be taken down and placed in a museum. They can view them there and actually have the counter story of what some of these people did in history. And that's the thing that I think we should be focusing on, is the two sides to the story. And whether that's here or whether it's overseas, when you look at some of the perpetrators of slavery and things like that overseas, that people should be able to get both sides of the story. And then, you know, there's no issue there in regards to that.
Can I jump in with that, Stephen? Just wanted to build upon that point, because I think that's really important, John, is that idea of dialogical memorialisation, where rather than taking something away, you would put up, you know, it's an additive approach. So you would put up a plaque that responds to that original one. So, you know, local examples, I mean, there's one I read about in the conversation about the Esplanade at Fremantle with the Explorers Monument. And so there was a, you know, a statue that was put up to commemorate these explorers who were, you know, murdered by treacherous blacks, you know, the natives, you know, really offensive language by today's standards. And then the local people, you know, had a plaque that put up in response saying, you know, this statue is offensive, this plaque is offensive. You know, our people defended our country, and this is how that conflict occurred. And so I think that's really powerful to have that. Yeah, so to have that dialogue between, you know, contested history, to show that there is contested, you know, it's contested.
That's right. That's right. We want to balance. We want to balance.
It's interesting. You touched on several things, and there's a couple of questions that I'll get to in a minute. But one of the things that got me really annoyed in the last couple of weeks was watching a TV news report interviewing an historian about the question of, are monuments sacred? Can they be, you know, torn down? And as if, and this interview was interviewing an historian as if historians are all in favour of keeping monuments. So have this, you know, this homogenous view of historians must be interested in history, therefore they must be all about wanting to save monuments, perhaps reinterpret them, but not tear them down. And as you've just said, John, and I agree with you, I think in some cases they should come down. So I was annoyed that all historians are painted with the same brush, but I think it's, as you've just expressed, you know, part of that conversation should be about whether some monuments just need to come down.
And what is a sacred site as far as a monument is concerned? When you look at the Aboriginal site over in Western Australia that Rio Tinto blew up, I mean, that is a monument of upwards of 65,000 years of Aboriginal, you know, connection to this continent. I mean, there's a different way of looking at things, and they want to protect the bloody statue, you know.
Yeah, that's the point I also wanted to make about, and also like about the Japwang birthing trees in Victoria as well. So you know, the big fight that community has had to stop the bulldozers from tearing down those trees. So yeah, I just don't see that disconnect between what is sacred. So it's basically coming down to my stuff's sacred but not yours in the same sense.
But what is history?
Exactly.
Whose history are we talking about?
Yeah. So I think that's the bigger picture that I think people just get caught up with the materialism of these statues, but like it's the bigger, it's these bigger issues that are like, I think I saw a really cool cartoon about showing a statue, and then when it's got broken down, you can see like the roots, and like, you know, that's like the structural racism and everything. So I guess these statues are really rooted in all those structural issues. And so I think that's, I don't know, like addressing the statue issue, we need to go to that sort of greater, deeper undercurrents rather than just what's on the surface.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we were supposed to be, there's been mentioned frontier wars. I mean, there's no mention of Cook when he come up shore at Kamei. He's the man who shot the first 3 shots with the rifle, the musket at Aboriginal people, which sets the tone for the future. So when the Aboriginal men came down to the beach and basically stating quite clearly, you are not welcome, Cook's levelled a musket, fired once over the head, fired a second time with small shot at the legs, and then fired a third shot, which, well, you know, whether someone was wounded or later died, we're not to know. But that set the tone. And I mean, for me, and as I said, Cook has always holds the position of the quintessential bogeyman for Aboriginal Australia, because everything that comes after, invasion, occupation, dispossession, cultural destruction, segregation, assimilation, you could just go on. It has a beginning point. And at 1770, that's the beginning, that's the ignition point for all of this. So, you know, that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that I wanted to get to too, was whether we often think of the Frontier Wars beginning in 1788, and it's almost kind of accepted. But you raise the point, John, that should we consider it as 1770 or earlier, perhaps? And perhaps that's something that we can hold onto, because there's a couple of questions I do want to get to. And the first one was from Adele about museums and the criticisms that it faced when it first opened, focusing on First Nations exhibitions. Adele was wondering whether, Mariko or John, you think that a lot has changed in the last 20 years?
Was that in reference to the National Museum opening? Is that what the question was relating to? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's still a progress, you know, it's a process that's undergoing. But yeah, I think there's been significant inroads made in terms of, you know, more First Nation staff being employed in these spaces, and then more capacity for, you know, First Nations led, you know, programming, you know, in terms of content matter. Yeah, so, and just looking back at like the Museums Australia policy, so, you know, previous possessions, new obligations, and continuing culture's ongoing responsibilities, you know, that shift from the material to the relational, you know, focusing more on communities rather than, you know, just the materialism of the objects. So now with the Indigenous roadmap, I think we've got a pathway over the next decades, but yeah, I think unless we address some of these sort of structural issues, I think, yeah, that's going to be the key to making really big impact and progress and change.
It also...
Sorry, it's Stephen. It's a work in progress, and we still have a long way to go. But
That's right.
It's really an exciting development, the way things are going, and certainly it's comes a long way since, you know, 1970. Say, I mean, none of this sort of discussion, you know. So we have progressed, if you like, but still have a long way to go.
And it relates to another question from Erin, which is specifically to Mariko, but John, jump in. Wondering whether the museum sees this exhibition as a decolonising exercise, or does your institution consider this as indigenising rather than working with colonial tools to undertake the project to tell the truth?
It's a great question, because like I mean, how we defined decolonisation with, and also indigenising, I mean, that's probably, you know, a conversation for another day too. I think you talk a lot about that, but yeah, I mean, we see it as decolonising in the sense that we're taking that focus away and trying to sort of address the colonial frameworks and that sort of thing. But yeah, in a way, we're also indigenising. So if you look back at how I was talking about the objectives, the key objectives identified for this exhibition from the community consultation. So you've got like, you know, that truth-telling aspect, and then also the, including more Indigenous perspectives and voices. So I think you can see it as, you know, twofold in that regard. So it depends on how, I guess, you define what decolonising a museum means. Does it mean that because a museum is such a colonial institution, is the only true way to decolonise is to basically, you know, tear it down? So I guess it depends on that. But I think indigenising is one strategy, definitely. But another one my colleague spoke about last year at the Australian Museums and Galleries Association conference was about disruption as strategy. So maybe that's another way to think about it as well. Yeah, so it's interesting.
John, do you have any thoughts on decolonising museums in general?
Well, I think the approach that they're taking is certainly along that road, and I think it's a journey we need to take. And I mean, that's a part of the process. And looking at the museum, it's not just the exhibition, but the website. I mean, I was involved there last year with a talk there. There's been a number of talks there, and I mean, that's again encouraging us into the space, and those things are being well supported. I mean, talks are, you know, highly attended, big attendances, and I'm sure Mariko would say the website is well, you know,
yes, I should mention that
well
too.
looked at.
Yes.
You know, so you've got a lot of content coming in from from the Aboriginal voice and the Aboriginal perspective, which is critically important, and I totally support.
Oh, thanks for highlighting that, John. Stephen, I'll just quickly mention about our website, because especially as COVID was setting in and we were just in a kind of a holding pattern about the scheduling with the exhibition, Laura and myself and other members of the First Nations team, we were working with the web team at the museum. We were working on the First Nations webpage. So another way to engage and create a platform for First Nations voices. So we were engaging with community and you know, to author articles. So John was one who authored articles for us about the Aboriginal Progress Association and also about Cook as well. So that's another great way, especially in this COVID world, you know, post-COVID as well. People are going to be relying upon websites, online materials for information as well. So this is really a great way for, you know, Indigenous writers, people to be putting up content. So yeah, that's great. Thanks for highlighting that, John.
No worries.
I just wanted to just ask everyone if there's any further questions. Please do post them as we go. But we will have a little bit of time towards the end. John, I just wanted to touch on something that you did with Peter Fitzsimons
Right.
a little while ago. You did a talk at the National Maritime Museum, which was really good. I really appreciated what you did there. At one point, Peter brought up a book that I'm not sure that you were familiar with then, a book that came out a couple of years ago called Lying for the Admiralty. And it essentially suggests that Cook was such a great navigator that he couldn't have missed Bass Strait, that he couldn't have missed Port Jackson, Sydney Harbour, that he must have been lying for the Admiralty, which makes him an even greater navigator in the author's eyes. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, whether, I don't think Peter Fitzsimons was really, you know, he hadn't really worked out what was going on there either. Because the way I see it, that actually makes the argument even stronger that we were touching on before, that Cook is even more associated with the project of colonisation and empire than we like to think of him, if we can just quietly put him into the box of great navigator.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the secret instructions of which we know about, and which Cook eventually ignored because he was supposedly to open up discussion and gain consent of Aboriginal people to gain some trading posts, and then of course claimed the entire East Coast. But what is the undercurrent of all of that? You know, in reality, is it's a sort of a voyage to map out, if you like, of the possibilities of further conquest. I mean, and that's the reality. And again, as I said earlier, everything that came after follows this event in 1770. And again, I mean, I think Cook and the British at that time certainly had access to maps that were earlier produced, you know, so, you know, that gave evidence of what was possible down here. So, yeah.
And Mariko, perhaps you had some thoughts too on that attachment of Cook to the frontier wars. I mean, I guess I'm trying to get to, in some ways, that the discussion is about Captain Cook and the frontier wars, whether we should be moving from one to the other, or what are the connections and crossover points, or are they? Should we be doing both at once? If you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I guess coming back to that whole thing about 1770 or from 1788. I mean, it's about, you know, I guess with frontier wars, you know, is that conflict and that engagement where, you know, there's conflict from the beginning. And yeah, I think it needs to, that's why you need, I think, to consider from 1770 onwards. And it's a complex question. But yeah, I think that there's, definitely, you know, there's links with the, you know, the Greygull warriors, you know, what happened with Cook at Kamay. And I mean, yeah, just need to, I think, look, yeah, like it's just looking beyond that to see all those various events. I think particularly, yeah, like from the First Fleet onwards, yeah. So it's a big one, yeah. I'm just trying to think for more.
It's
complex,
but you know, let's take it from the point of the first shots fired.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking with the with the Greygull warriors. So I mean, that's where you can link it to 1770. Yeah,
absolutely.
Maybe a question for both of you too. That in 50 years' time, the 300th anniversary moment, what would you both see as what should be happening in museums and perhaps in broader commemoration as well?
Part of me thinks, which is that we wouldn't have, you know, have to have these conversations. That, I mean, hopefully by then, that we've, you know, redefined, you know, how we engage and sort of, represent these sort of events. So, because I mean, that question's come up for us about what are you guys going to do with the 250th anniversary of, you know, 1788, and it's like, well, hopefully we're not going to be having this conversation. So yeah, I guess it's about like just the more different, you know, learning more about the history and more about the different perspectives. So just having all the stories coming out, but I think we need to think about how we use anniversaries as this vehicle for some, you know, this sort of nationalism and patriotism. So I think we need to re-examine what we use these anniversaries for. And my colleague Nathan Sentence has written quite extensively on that particular topic.
I think that's important. And again, I wish I was going to be here in another 50 years, and I ain't going to be here in another 50 years. But at least this point here, there is a start point, and we have the potential to move into a future, you know, for our kids and our grandkids and generations to come, where there's more balanced understanding of the past and hopefully the shared future, where we can all come together. I mean, I'm not wanting Cook to be, you know, rolled into the dustbin of the past. I mean, I've said before, I mean, he deserves to be recognised as an incredible navigator and cartographer and the leader of his crews. I mean, yes, that's a given. But there's the other stuff from our perspective, as I've said over and over again, that impacts onto us. It's getting that understanding of both perspectives and understanding that, which is critically important. And again, as Mariko said, that let's hope in another 50 years we don't have to have these conversations or discussions, that we are able to sit down together and really enjoy the past and the future.
One thing I just wanted to just contribute was about an observation I had with, you know, just focus on Cook, where if we're looking at Cook and colonisation, I mean, interestingly, where is Banks and Matra being in focus of this? I thought it was just always really interesting looking into the history that, you know, I see Cook as, you know, he was a public servant who did his job. He was given instructions, you know, by the Royal Society about, you know, tracking the transit of Venus, and then he got his secret instructions from the, you know, the British Admiralty. And, you know, Cook was dead by the time, like, you know, the First Fleet came about. You know, he was dead in 1779, and then Australia itself wasn't, you know, became into being, and it wasn't federated until 1901. It's just so interesting how he is just seen as being, you know, the founding father, so to speak, of Australia, where you need to have closer examination of, you know, the players like Sir Joseph Banks and James Maria Matra, who were the ones who put forward proposals to Parliament by virtue of their, you know, influential position, that they were able to go up to that, you know, level in government to put their case to, you know, Lord Sydney. Yeah, I just feel like we need to examine that aspect as well, where I think Cook gets a lot of credit and focus, where what about these other developments? And that brings into the whole thing about, you the transportation of convicts and how there's these bigger cultural, historical issues that were happening in, the late 1700s that had a lot to do with how this penal colony in New South Wales came about. So yeah, I just feel a bit, for Matra, like, I don't know if Matraville's the only thing that's named after Matra, but when you compare the Cook's like everywhere, but yeah, Matra gets Matraville, and I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I find it's interesting how, yeah, those other people don't get nearly as much attention as Cook, in my perspective.
I agree, Mariko. I think the spotlight needs to go on to the rich fancy boy Joseph Banks a lot more, and he's influenced. And I mean, we've all stepped over him, where maybe there should be more focus on him, and certainly the influential circles that he moved in, and the people that he was able to influence, and the power that he wielded. Which, and again, I've said before that Cook, yes, I mean, we come from a different background entirely to Banks.
That's right.
And moved in a different social sphere to what Joseph Banks did. So, the doors that Banks could walk through, I doubt very much that James Cook could walk through. So I think he should be much more accountable as far as history is concerned.
That's right.
For the impact onto us that is not looked at as much. And maybe that spotlight needs to go on, as I said, the rich fancy boy.
And that could be the benefit of this discussion as we learn more about, like, I'm just, a history buff. So, I mean, learning about that was kind of fascinating. And also the relationship between, like, what was happening with the American Revolution, even. You kind of think, what's that got to do with Australia, where, at the time when Cook's made his, did his voyage, and between those 18 years, I think, between 1770 and 1788, really need greater focus. Yeah, so that's something I was reading. I think Andrew Tink's done some really interesting research on like the British case for the colony, and how the American colonies being lost was one reason why they looked towards somewhere else they need to dump their convicts. So it's yeah, and considering Matra's background as a loyalist in New York, so his family was from there. So yeah, it's just this could be an opportunity for us just to just learn more about history and not be selective about our history, where we let ideology get pitted against historical accuracy. I think that's the focus that I've taken with my work. Yeah.
Yep.
It kind of I think it kind of relates to a question or a comment that Peter made about whether, without tertiary studies in humanities, whether this discussion would deliver any more in 50 years.
That's a great point. Yeah.
There's a question. There's also a question here from Megan. She says that we've talked about the Cook statues, but what about the existence and the planned use of the Endeavour replica for the 250 moment? How should we make use of the ship in the future as a way to explore a more balanced understanding of the past? And I think, John, you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I said earlier to you, Stephen, that I think COVID sank the Endeavour's 2020 circumnavigation of Australia, mythic circumnavigation of Australia, because it was, a fictitious account of history, because as we know, the Endeavour didn't circumnavigate Australia. So, I didn't lose any sleep over that event not taking place. And the Endeavour itself as a replica and as a museum piece, I've been on the Endeavour down there at Darling Harbour and had a look and was amazed at that ship. I mean, the size of it, it's not much bigger than a tennis court. I mean, I was amazed at how small that ship is. So you get some idea of visiting something like that. But I think it should be, certainly I would have no problems in that ship being used coming into Kamei, and certainly going up into the Endeavour River, and in regards to history, concerned with, what happened in 1770. But again, I was certainly opposed to the circumnavigation of Australia. So, yeah.
So not so much opposed to it being used as part of a commemoration on the day, despite that being considered to be a reenactment by most people?
Well, it depends on what side of the coin you're coming at. I mean, Aboriginal people clearly observed that vessel coming into Kamei and what they made of it. I mean, and certainly even more so up in Queensland, where they actually went on board, and which we know they then observed all their turtles on board, which they wanted to share. So we had connections with that ship, and they even set the grass on fire to actually burn the ship because they were refused to hand over some of the turtles that belonged to the local people. So we have a connection in some sense with the ship, in a positive sense of trying to get rid of it. So, so yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Mariko, do you have any thoughts about that? Whether using the replica in the future is, how could it be? I mean, John's explained how it might be a valuable thing in terms of understanding more complex histories, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, my opinions. I think I agree with what you and John have been discussing, those points, but I personally don't really see, like the Endeavour having that focus beyond really. Like, I guess it's a vehicle for them being able to go up the East Coast. I see, just limited, benefits on continuing to sort of glorify it. So I guess coming back to the consultation with, people saying we just don't want to see that sort of, we don't want to see the ships and that anymore. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Well, we've just got a few more minutes to go. So if there's any more questions, please get them in now. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap up. And just maybe, Mariko, if you wanted to have any final thoughts on what the museum is planning.
I think I'd also like to take the opportunity just to kind of reflect on what, like, a lot of the cultural institutions have been doing, like, especially yourselves at Maritime Museum, National Museum, also State Library of New South Wales as well, doing these exhibitions that really are bringing to fore the Indigenous voices. And I just think it's really beneficial, and we have to commend ourselves for doing these exhibitions and projects. So I think just want to do a shout out to that, and really just making museums more these platforms and more opportunities to hear diverse stories. And so I think that's just really important, and just to learn as much of our history as possible, and then people can make informed views. So knowledge is power.
And on
that's the positive to come out of this. And again, as I said, with the exhibition, the website, the talks, I mean, it's a I guess a showcase of best practice with it. Aboriginal people have given us the space, the floor to put across our perspective, and I mean that's the critical way forward in all of this, and I certainly endorse that.
Yeah, and it's redefining and revolutionising curatorial practice. I think it's going to rewrite sort of a lot of the guides on how you do with curating Indigenous exhibitions, and that's one reason why the decision was made for the Australian Museum's consultation data to be made publicly available. So that was important to us, that even other cultural institutions can take stock of that information and use it for the benefit of community. That's really the goal. It's not about competitiveness or anything. I think the main goal is making sure community is well served and represented by us. We see ourselves as facilitators, not curators. We facilitate the voices of community.
Yep.
And just on that, there was a comment, really a thank you for the discussion, and thank you for the resource recommendations, Mariko. I don't know if you wanted to suggest any further. I'd like to suggest one on Frontier Wars. There's a podcast called Frontier War Stories. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Bo from Brisbane runs it. You can get it. You can find it easy. Just search.
Oh, Bo Spearham? Is that Bo Spearham's one? Yeah.
Frontier War Stories, and you'll find it on Spotify. It's fantastic. I think he's done 8 or 9 episodes now. So a big shout out to Bo. That's a great podcast in COVID times to listen to. So any closing comments, John?
Oh no, look, just a pleasure. I mean, I think this is another way forward. I mean, events like this and reaching out to audiences in this fashion as well is another way forward, and technology comes to the fore. I mean, you know, I'm not with no technology savvy, but I've been doing so much of this stuff in recent times, and we certainly reach out and in a broad way, I guess, than a lecture theatre. So it's great.
Yeah, it's been kind of weird, hasn't it? That we,
yeah, it has.
On one sense, in one level, we're closing in and isolating, and another level, we're actually making, reaching out, which is fantastic.
Connections. Yeah, it is. It is.
And that reminds me that the next History Effect event will be in a week's time, 7th of July, when we have episode 2 of Careers in History. Who'd want to work in history? Which will be career journeys in museums and archives through the eyes of 2 dynamic young historians, Alinda Bierhutzen and Bonnie Wildy. So check out the History Council website and social media for booking information about that one. So thank you very much, Mariko. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mariko.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the team at History Council. It's been great. I mean, it's a long time waiting to have this conversation, but better late than never, huh?
Totally different to what we were expecting, that's for sure.
Oh, very much. Yeah, very much.
But no, it's great. Thanks again.
Yeah, cheers.
All right, thanks everyone.